Okay, I think we start in the interest of time to this last but not the least session here on enhanced approach where all questions raised during the morning will be acceptably resolved. I'm looking now at Kowid. No, but as we have discussed before, this is in a way this is the aim is not different and the goal is not different, but it can be made in a different way using an enhanced approach. And so we will start off with the first presentation from Kowid on general aspects and what our expectations are. And then we we will go on with one talk from Brendan Hughes on continuous process verification, or whether it was continued or whatever it was. And then Frank Zettl from Roche will come into the scale down models, but we have discussed it before, but this will be more from an enhanced process perspective. So please, Kowid.
Thank you. So this is almost the final round of presentation I will be making. And we will start with the enhanced approach now. So actually, our intention was initially to really keep it this for the very last part of this workshop, because our main target was to see what should be covered by process validation, whatever the approach. And now in this session, what we would try to see is further clarification of some of the concepts we discussed earlier with regards to traditional process validation, traditional approach used when you are doing process validation studies. But it is also to see what more should be done in the case of enhanced studies. And we did more or less this discussion already this morning, because there's no such thing as full traditional anymore. Enhanced, well, how enhanced needs to be enhanced to be really considered as enhanced? That's quite a difficult question, and it's I'm not sure we'll be able to answer this today, but at least try to contribute and for further clarification on these aspects. Well, whatever happens, the objective of the process validation, whatever the approach used, is the same. It is to establish scientific evidences that the process is capable of consistently delivering a quality drug substance. So that's the same. Now the data expected, well, actually, they will also be the same. We would expect, from a regulatory perspective, to have a proper process evaluation. We expect to have a proper process verification, and where appropriate, we could also think about the possibility of having some continuous process verification built in the development of this given process. And again, we will also need some continued process verification. So I will not go back on this difference on continuous and continued again, but I'm sure we will bring it up again during the discussion. Now, in terms of process evaluation, well, the main difference are the expectations in terms of what should be demonstrated. And in here, as compared to a traditional approach, we would expect to have a much more comprehensive understanding of the process and the product. And this could certainly be presented in the process evaluation part. So, in this expectation, we also expect to have a more systematic approaches that are used in this development, and we expect to see some enablers used, such as tools like PAT tools, multivariate analysis, the use of DOEs, the demonstration that the models are suitable, and we will certainly actually put even more weight on the reliability and how predictable these different models are as compared to a traditional approach. And here we also will put a higher weight on the understanding on the relationship between what goes into a given process or a given step, how the conditions are influencing the output. So here we really expect to have a good understanding on the relationship between input, the conditions, as well as the output. So what is the relationship? Is this just correlation? Are we really talking about causality? When you're moving this, it has this impact, or it is just correlation? Now we really want to understand what you know about all this relationship. Here also we have a higher expectation in terms of robustness demonstration. We expect to have actually a much more an experimentation that will actually push the limits a little bit further, so that we are sure that your process is very robust, even if you push it wider than what you would normally be using for normal production situations. Again, the suitability and predictability of the scaled-down models you're using here are very important. So depending on what you will be demonstrating, we will perhaps consider this as a good qualitative models. Perhaps you may also, in addition to that, have some relevance with regards to quantitation and prediction quantitatively. Hopefully, you can also demonstrate that for the given attributes for the purpose, it is scale independent. So this is the type of data we will also expect to see and have to evaluate in the case of enhanced approach. Actually, you will have to evaluate this in all cases, whether it's traditional or enhanced, but we certainly will have to rely more on the models here. We will have to rely a lot more on your experimentation here as compared to a traditional approach. So this is a regulatory authority's perspective. Now, what we would like to hear is what, from the industry perspective, would you consider performing when you are following an enhanced approach? What more would you do as compared to a traditional approach? Are you in disagreement with what I've just been saying, or what more would you expect in such approach? Now, we also touched upon this already with regards to the reliability and predictability of small-scale models. Also have a few points on adaptive processes with feedback and feed-forward loops. Now, with regards to process verification, well, again, we will require that this verification is performed. The compliance of the complete process to the control strategy will be expected to be performed. So we will expect to have in-process testing to be presented, a batch analysis to be presented. Again, it will be on an appropriate number of batches. Now, the number of batches, of course, can be discussed depending on how much process knowledge, how much you can demonstrate at the evaluation stage that could actually leverage the request for a certain number of batches. Again, we can always have an alternative approach, meaning a continuous process verification approach could be considered. As mentioned earlier, is something that is science and risk-based. It's real-time approach. It is enabled by several tools. And thinking about this, actually, I was wondering if such approach is very realistic at the time of marketing authorization, trying to submit a continuous process verification. Not saying it's impossible, but at the current stage of knowledge and practices we have, wouldn't this be actually more appropriate once the manufacturer has accumulated sufficient knowledge by producing sufficient number of batches before really going towards a continuous process verification? So that's also some point we would like to hear for some feedback from the industry. And as for any process validation activity, you would need to have some continued process verification. And here we will actually expect to have verification on an ongoing basis, to have evidence, for instance, that you have a design space verification protocol included in your dossier that will actually tell us what you will be doing in terms of testing when you are moving within the design space. Now, this is certainly a diagram that will trigger a lot of discussion. Now, I tried here to summarize at least my thinking about what should be in the process validation studies. Now, when you talk about process parameters that will be tested within a given range, well, this range tested may actually show that it has an impact on the CQA, so it will lead to a CPP, and I think this is not an issue. Everybody agrees on that part, and this will be included in process validation. The most tricky part is actually the other ones, or the ones that are demonstrated to not have any impact on CQAs for the given range that has been tested. And actually, the difficulty here is to draw the line of what should be included in the process validation studies or not. So depending on what are the ranges that has been tested and what are the target ranges you will be performing in routine production, well, you may actually lead to different outcomes. Well, if you look at the case on the left, well, you may have actually target ranges that are slightly wider than the ranges that you have been tested, or are very close to the ranges that have been tested. But in such case, we may have some doubts on the criticality assessment of your CPP, of your process parameters here, and we may think that actually the ranges you have tested may be so limited that if you actually widen this, you may have an impact that has not been detected in your design of experiment, in your experimentation. So in such situation, since it is very difficult to conclude, we most likely will consider it as a potential CPP, meaning that it will certainly should be handled as a CPP, even if it was not demonstrated to have an impact on the CQA, because we have doubts on this conclusion. We have similar situations here where, in the middle, where actually we have the range tested slightly wider than the target ranges. So in this case, is again quite difficult to conclude. Either these ranges are widened and tested to see if it has any impact on the CQA, or again, it should be considered as a potential CPP. So these two cases are very close to each other, actually. It's really, we have doubts on this criticality, then we would be on the safe side and consider it as a potential CPP. Now, in case you actually demonstrated that it has no impact and the range tested were quite wide as compared to your target ranges, and we will agree that they are non-CPPs in that case. Well, it's not done yet. Well, this is also one of the tricky part is for these non-CPPs, which one should be included in process validation? And here, this is where we want to have some information of the non-CPPs that have an impact on the on performance indicators. So this is again, this is coming from a compromise. Since we can't call this a CQAs, we will call this a performance indicator, since this is information we want to see. So the proposal is actually to include these non-CPPs that have an impact on this performance indicator. Now, we need to also decide at the end what should be considered as performance indicators and what should not. That's also the purpose of all the discussions we had before, is to see where to draw the line, what should be put as performance indicator for downstream, for the upstream, and we'll see what we can draw out of all this discussion for the document. While the one for which are non-CPPs and that do not have any impact on performance indicators, then we would agree to not even include this data in the dossier and in the validation studies. So at the end of the day, our expectations, I try to compare here the traditional and enhanced approach, where in the case of a traditional approach, you have some you rely a little bit somewhat on evaluation to understand how this was appropriately developed, but we rely much more on the process verification and the commercial batches that has been produced, and this is a high burden on this verification. While continued process verification is actually somewhat variable depending, and if not lacking in some traditional approaches. While in the case of an enhanced approach, actually we're going to rely a lot more on the evaluation, and the verification will have a lower weight as compared to the traditional approach. But here, on the other hand, we will have to rely a lot more on the continued process verification also. And I think that should be it for now. Thank you.
So our next speaker will be Brendan Hughes.
So my name is Brendan Hughes. I work for Bristol Myers Squibb. I'm in charge of the Program Management Office for CMC, part of our biologics. For this meeting, I was part of the enhanced team, and you'll see when Frank shows his acknowledgement slide, the team members, I'd like to thank them in advance for the work they did, and particularly for the opportunity to present our clear thoughts on CPV today. So what I wanted to do again was just to start off with a simple definition of what we're trying to achieve with validation. Talk a little bit about process knowledge and how we generate that. I think Kowid said it already today, in that the fundamental underpinning of any validation program, and particularly CPV, is based on the process knowledge we gain and the control strategy that's elaborated as a result of that. I'll refer to small-scale models and create the opening for Frank's presentation, where small-scale models are fundamentally enabling for this, and then talk a little bit about confirmation at scale and the value that brings, and then talk about continued process verification as part of lifecycle management. So we start off with, again, a definition around the requirement to produce evidence that a process consistently produces product that meets predetermined specifications. I think a contextual point that we wanted to make was that process validation is an evolving landscape with a greater focus on a life cycle approach. And as we get into the discussion this afternoon, I think that's important for us in industry, as how we leverage our initial validation and we leverage continuous process verification as part of our life cycle management as we go through the inevitable site changes and scale changes and process improvements. I think there's enormous value to industry in how we do that. And then I think, we wanted to make the point, and I think it's accepted to some extent, that an enhanced process development approach does not necessarily require us to take an enhanced process validation or CPV approach, and vice versa. There are proposals, theoretical proposals, where one could have a continuous process verification approach without it fully having some design space nominated for your process. What we believe is the fundamental enabler is the control strategy that we develop as we go through process development. So the prerequisites, I think, at this stage in our conversation today, this is, I think, self-evident, but it's a combination of the process knowledge we gain to understand the critical quality attributes of what eventually will constitute the medicine, and we get better at that every day. We're doing more collaboration with our clinical and preclinical colleagues to understand, what critical quality attributes are. And in terms of process knowledge, I think I heard some of the regulators say you're seeing more evidence of risk assessment, and a lot of companies are adopting what is, I suppose, seen to be now an enhanced approach. There's a lot more, we have a lot more tool sets available to us. So the level of process knowledge we have as we move towards commercialization is probably much improved. And there's a fundamental, again, very valuable contribution made here from small-scale studies, and we can talk about that. Control strategy that derives from our understanding of the relationship between the process and the product. We have a whole raft of mechanisms for implementing that control strategy, and that will adapt as we go through the product life cycle. over time. I referred briefly to some of the way our science is developing. So at the top line, our understanding of CQAs, we can be more thoughtful as we collaborate with colleagues in clinical and preclinical development, as we understand better the molecule that's in our hands and its heterogeneity and the impact that that might have on its behavior as a medicine, we begin to build a better picture of what a particular protein product can do. And then the data that's in our hands generally by the time we get to commercialization will be a combination of small-scale studies, pilot-scale studies that we've perhaps used to supply toxicology material, of course, clinical manufacturing batches, and eventually some element of scale-up batches as we prepare to commercialize the product. I think it's a point that we in industry are noting is that as our process sciences colleagues deliver higher and higher, tighter processes, the number of clinical batches we run is reducing. So, there was a time when that would constitute a very significant amount of your data. That's declining, so we have to supplement that now with other design experiments and our leveraging of our small-scale models. And that's a feature of the development of the industry. Frank will give a much more thorough evaluation here, but we just wanted to position, following on from what I said about the available data we have at any kind of scale being limited. So our use of the tool set of small-scale models or scaled-down models has become very significant, and it's if we try to replicate the density of information we get from our small-scale studies at any kind of large scale, it would become prohibitively expensive and take far too long. We really wouldn't be able to develop products in any kind of time. So we're now looking at a combination of those different features. And what we've learned with well-designed experiments and the kind of data analysis tools we have now, we can create a very, very significant database as we go through process characterization and understand the process at small scale. And I think we can have the discussion when Frank finishes about how much we can depend on that and how much approximation we have to account for as we assess the difference between small scale and commercial scale operations. So the control strategy, and we had some discussions about this in Q11. Our fundamental aim here is to understand how our process interacts with the CQAs and delivers what we intend as the product, as a drug substance. And I think we had the discussions, and Kowid referred to it today in response to a question I had. We talked about, it's got to be very comprehensive, a control strategy now. We need to understand raw materials, intermediates. We need to understand process parameter control. And we are learning that, parameters can have an impact on multiple CQAs, and we look through. One of the things we've learned to do is to have a very integrated view of our control strategy, moving all the way from the bioreactor down to the downstream, so that we link all of the steps together to have a full understanding of what influences product quality. So I had just a couple of examples here, and I think this is mainly to reflect on where we have come from and to some extent where we're going, because I think if we look at what we're trying to achieve with continuous process verification, and there is a slide where we compare them coming up, I think to enable an effective continuous process verification strategy as a true alternative to validation, we need to really deepen our understanding of the process and the material. So if we look at, in the bioreactor, what can we learn about actually making the correct product from the start? So we make sure we've got the right coding sequence in there, but how well do we understand the factors in a bioreactor that make sure we get the right glycosylated form, we get the right folded form, so that we can engineer that so that we're in control at that stage. In the downstream, our main our main activity is to try to select and protect what we've actually made. If we make the correct product, how do we ensure that that's maintained in its integral form? And finally, as we move towards drug product, how do we preserve that? So I think when we think about continuous process verification, we need to think about how much we can define about these controls so that as we look at data streaming off a process, we can have the confidence that every batch is going to deliver the product quality we need. And so, for example, if we look at across a process, we understand that whole cell protein will be evolved as cells fall apart in a bioreactor. We learn how they're cleared in the downstream. So if you look at high molecular weight, we can have, there may be cell culture conditions that promote that, and then there are downstream conditions that may promote it or indeed remove it. And so if you think about guaranteeing yourself that every batch you make of a product will have an acceptable limit of high molecular weight, we need to have understood the conditions that evolve and remove that material in the process and have the right kind of control strategy that by looking at the data, and I'll talk a little bit about the systems we're beginning to leverage for that you can look at a data set coming off a process almost in real time, preferably in real time, to understand the level of control you have is going to deliver a product with the right characteristics. Oops. One of the things we spoke about in Q11 was the role of full-scale batches in an overall strategy for process validation. And something that I would like us to discuss when we finish is that if we are using an approach where we have evolved an understanding of the factors impacting product quality, what's the role of the full-scale batches that we do explore? Is it, I've indicated on the left-hand side that the value we achieve from a small scale and other sub-commercial scale batches is that we get an opportunity to generate a lot more data. We have a lot more information, and we can run sophisticated interaction studies to generate process understanding. So this is where the basic data set that we use to understand the process comes from. And in our conversation this morning, I think Nana was referring to how, if you get 3 batches provided to you, you wonder about all the other data that you're not seeing. And I think this is the data set that I think we would like to leverage, where you might see normal operating ranges in a filing. Now you get to see the background information that shows how far away from edges you are, for instance, in any particular set of parameters. As we move towards the larger scale, our opportunities to do experiments like that are reduced for time and cost reasons and flexibility of plant. And so what we need to do here is design any full-scale runs we do to verify what we've learned at small scale. And again, we can learn some of that from Frank's presentation. But if we have an understanding of our process, we're not going to be able to explore all of the limits for all the parameters at scale. It's not possible. So how do we just, one of the discussions we can have is what kind of study design can we run that we run a set of runs at scale that confirm that the process data we've elaborated at small scale is actually valid for the commercial scale. And there's another industry point I know that we're keen to get input from the regulators on. Again, in conversation as we went through Q11, it was very clear to us that there needs to be in the filing sufficient evidence to show that the process is validated. I know we had that discussion a number of times, that there needs to be a moment in time when the industry demonstrates in the filing that what's the process that is to be reviewed and approved has been validated. And so we need to talk about that in the context of CPV programs that are composed of this kind of information. So we have laboriously talked about continuous and continued So I think Kowid made a very nice summary, and we talked about this as an industry group yesterday as we prepared. And the first definition that we arrived at, I think it's from ICH, is that continuous process verification is an alternative approach to process validation in which manufacturing process performance is continuously monitored and evaluated. That it demonstrates that the process is under control. It's based on the control strategy and process knowledge. I think the key for us in our discussion today is that the first definition is easy to align on. It sounds very good. It's an alternative. It's continuous. But I think for industry and regulators to absolutely understand what that means, what do we mean by continuous? What kind of data sets are we providing? What kind of reassurance do we provide in data terms that we have a process that's under control? So that's got to do with the selection of the parameters we measure, how we measure them, what data we have at any particular point in time. So I think that would be a valuable discussion for us to have, because as I said, the definition is relatively easy to align on. And where that in the life cycle of a product, so in the early stages, as we develop processes, we do not know that we're going to end up with a commercial product. It's quite late on that we begin to understand that something may end up being commercialized. So at what point in the product life history have we got sufficient process understanding to start to apply continuous process verification and generate data sets that can go in our filing and convince the agency that we have truly exerted control. I think continued process verification in some ways is a little easier to align on, because we're doing it quite often now in terms of using the tools of continued process monitoring. A lot of companies are now trying to generate the confidence about how our process operates. We're looking at multivariate analysis, pretty sophisticated data analysis tool sets that give us early warning when a process is trending in the wrong direction, rather than simply testing to see that something has been in specification. We have multiple control points where we're now trying to understand. We get early reads of a change perhaps evoked by a new raw material. Would we see that in some of our process monitoring? So I think that's different. It's to some extent already underway. It's part of ongoing manufacturing and life cycle management. And I think this is one of the areas, I think, where we think that there could be significant advantage for us as we consider the life cycle of a process, where we move to different sites. We may change scales. We may have other changes that are less significant than we talked about this morning, where we radically change the layout of steps. But as we go through some of the normal life cycle management, how valuable is it to have this data set available? And I think, again, it was referred to this morning that as a manufacturer develops a process history where we have many, many batches in commercial space, maybe that puts us in a much better place to start using this kind of data set and these tools. Maybe that's where we start off in this new approach to validation, is we start with commercial processes where we have a lot of data history and we're beginning to generate our process understanding and start applying some of these concepts to our life cycle. Maybe that's the way we get to this new understanding of how to manage process validation. So for both continued and continuous process verification, there's a few points we wanted to make that we think are important. These approaches are going to be integrated. It really needs to be firmly based on process knowledge, and the testing and monitoring programs, as I showed in a couple of examples, need to be fully integrated. We can only understand the overall process impact on CQAs if we're looking at upstream and downstream impacts on the product and understanding those parameters. I think there are a range of measurements, and there are tools becoming available to us, every day now, which give us some more opportunity to do online or at-line testing, whereas we used to have to take samples and have a time delay. So there's some technology acting in our favor. I think the analysis is key. tool sets we use and the statistical approaches we use are important. And then finally, I know that it's been made clear a number of times. I've heard from regulators and within our own, within the industry, that these systems are only effective if they're very actively managed, that people are reviewing the data, not just at the annual report time, but continuously, that we understand what's going on within the process. Oops. So I've already asked this question this morning, but again, we return to it. You know, what do we measure within these systems, either in continuous or continued process verification? Clearly, the major focus is on critical quality attributes and the CPPs that impact them. I think COVID provoked us to think about other processing parameters that we might not be so confident about, and I think that may account for some of the discussion that's gone on about design space. You know, regulators are saying that there are parts of design spaces, for instance, where we may not have the confidence we have because the critical quality attribute measurement is variable, or the process parameters are the control is not as tight as we'd wish. And I know regulators globally have asked for evidence that of how we would move around within that design space post-approval. So I think that feeds into this concept of, you know, we have critical process parameters. How do we evaluate those parameters and talk about them that we may have less control over? So what do we measure? My question today was around markers of process consistency. And so one of the discussions we want to have is when we say process consistency, ultimately, I think it has to be process consistency in terms of the critical quality attributes of the product. There are many different ways you can measure what's going on in a process, but we'd like to focus on process consistency where we have evidence that it impacts the critical quality attributes of the product. I made a point here, but there may be features of a process which we might think about as indicators. So there might be indicators of cell health that we measure. So that's an early warning that something which might have a downstream impact is changing in a process. So that would be a reasonable parameter to measure. And again, we realize that knowledge is going to develop over time and with batch manufacturing experience. We referred to material intermediate attributes and their linkage to CQA outcomes in a conversation this morning. And then finally, you know, again, tipping our hat to some of the technology changes. I know some companies are looking at probe systems which can look at a very wide range of materials in a reaction or in a bioreactor or in downstream, and begin to draw correlations between certain signals and process behavior. So as we move towards, you know, a system for biotechnology products where we can actually exert continuous process verification, some of those technology breakthroughs will be important. The data treatment we need to apply, I don't think there's anything new or special in terms of the tool sets we use, in terms of the analysis that we carry out. I think probably we would need to understand when it comes to filing what limits are regulatory limits and what are the kind of limits that allow us to react to, for instance, some of those early indicators of change. It would be useful for us to have that within our quality system so we can see trends or changes, react to them, and perhaps, you know, correct process drift that might be deriving from raw material or other variability. And then finally, I think when we talked about the use of this kind of approach, I think its initial application may well be in process change and improvement after a period of process understanding. I said I was going to just quickly share, you know, a number of companies have invested in pretty sophisticated process monitoring tool sets where we can get a constant stream of data coming off the process in real time and understand what's going on. I think for us to move into a continuous process verification mode, leveraging this type of tool set will be very important. For lifecycle management, I think an approach to validation which ended up with 3 batches and then we went into commercial manufacturing is probably less robust and less reliable than a system where we have an approach to process maintenance and improvement that leverages the data sets we talked about. And as I said, I think we have an opportunity to leverage this approach as we develop the process life cycle and we change equipment or scale raw materials, and we have these kind of analyses to help us to demonstrate that the process remains under control, and I think that was in Kowid's slides as well. So continued process verification is where we can show that despite the fact that we've perturbed the system with a change, that the state of control has been maintained. And my last slide is really about how we consider providing the information to the agency. It's hard to imagine that a continuous process verification approach, which is, provided as an alternate to traditional process validation, we would have to imagine that those data have to be part of the filing. Otherwise, we haven't been able to provide the evidence that the regulator needs. Continued process verification as part of lifecycle management, that may well be something that we describe the program, and then of course that the data get collected within the GMP system, and there's an important dialogue to have there between the reviewers and the inspectorate. So with that, I'd like to thank you for your attention and look forward to the discussion. Thank you.
Thank you, Brandon. Any immediate questions, clarification? So before we go into the discussion, I would like to introduce our last speaker. It's Frank Zettl from Roche Penzberg. He's in manufacturing process development. Looking forward to your presentation.
Yeah, thank you. And thank you for having the opportunity to speak here. And I'm very glad that I can speak to in the enhanced session, because I don't know what a traditional approach is. I think industry has always, they have to stick to the state of the art. So they always have been followed an enhanced approach. Traditionally, they have followed an enhanced approach. And I think the big question is whether the regulators give us an enhanced flexibility. So the key elements of an enhanced approach is for sure the extensive and the intensive process knowledge that we hopefully can demonstrate, and that we will demonstrate, and that we have a better prediction of scale effects. As already showed by Brandon, the leverage of the process knowledge into the control system is then done via the continuous and continued process verification. But the two first points are the important that we assess this via the scale-down models, and that's the topic of my talk. The scale-down model life cycle is something that we have to look at. They are usually designed within the development, and they are continuously improved during the development. During the qualification phase, we compare the outputs and we assess the suitability of the scale-down models. And then we have to maintain them. There might be site transfers, there might be major facility changes, reconstructions, and maybe in rare cases there might be new CQAs coming up, and in these cases we have to assess the validity of the scale-down models again. And they are usually also used for troubleshooting, so we cannot kind of stick to them as they were probably. Okay, next slide. So this is dealing with the scale-down model design. First of all, they are based on scientific and engineering principles, and we consider inputs and the environment very well. So I start from the bottom here somehow. The environment are things like sample handling, are things like materials of constructions, sample storage, online or offline analytical measurements. So there are a lot of details around which we have to look at. And of course, we have to define the relevant process outputs, for example, CQAs, but also performance indicators. So as already mentioned, the scale-down models, they are very useful already within the design phase. The whole process development is usually based on scale-down models, and also the characterization. And in some cases, especially the virus validation, they are already used during the development phase or during the clinical phases for validation efforts. So they have proven to be very useful and important. And as it was already mentioned during this morning's traditional session, we have different options for design of the process, and this information usually feeds from the development phase. Sometimes it's the gold standard is to have a whole unit operation model, but sometimes it is sufficient and no other way to have a scale-down model that covers specific aspects of a unit operation, and this can then be things like worst-case models. Okay, so there are a lot of options there, a lot of variability. Going to the next slide. This shows typical scale-down model systems for purification. We are currently going into the robotic systems. They are useful for some specific aspects to assess. The workhorses are the lab scale system with a column volume of about 20 milliliters, and they mimic then the production columns usually very well. Okay, on the next slide, there is some impressions about scale-down models in the fermentation. I think most frequent workhorse is the 2-liter systems, but there are also things like robotic systems to investigate specific aspects of processes. And the picture on the left down corner is to remind me that we do not only assess process output in the pools like CQAs and KPIs, we also do assess things like chromatograms and time courses of certain process performance indicators or CQAs. So, and this is more or less a summary of what was, I think, said today frequently or several times. They can be extremely useful scale-down models, and they can be extremely useful even if they do not exactly match the large-scale performance. In many cases, we do understand the differences. Only by scale-down models, we can explore a large number of process parameters, and we can explore large ranges. And I think this is really important. We do get really a deep insight into the processes, and it really decreases the risks when we use scale-down models. We can vary several process parameters independently and systematically, so that's the cornerstone for all DOE studies here. We can estimate quadratic effects and interaction effects. And I think it's also already accepted only the only way to investigate categorical variables systematically is by using scale-down models. So things like raw material lots, they can be investigated only by scale-down models. Okay, so the next slide, please. Qualification, that was also already addressed by Christian this morning and Norbert. I think it's clear that the statistical approach is the gold standard. But we have to admit that in many cases we do not have the required number of at-scale batches to do a thorough statistical approach here. And I think it's known that an N of 3 is not enough. So that's definitely something we have to discuss. It is dependent on the availability of manufacturing scale batches, but it should be possible to leverage the control strategy and also to assess what are the predictions that are made from the scale-down models. We also think that we should aim at that a generic qualification of scale-down models should be possible. I think that's definitely true for downstream unit operations. It might be more difficult for fermentation unit operations. I think we have to admit that we are not there yet. But for downstream, we have a huge history in this respect. Of course, this is depending on the understanding of the scale effects and also on the control strategy, which can be used to mitigate the risks here. we also do think that a concurrent revalidation or a concurrent validation should be possible in cases where maybe we do not have enough manufacturing scale batches at the time of filing. Okay, so this is an inside short glance on this equivalence statistical test, the TOST test. It's a very powerful tool. It has two informations, the observed offset between scales. So this is the difference between the zero difference line here in the middle. And so this is the offset here between the scales, and also the observed variability, which is here shown in this confidence intervals. And whenever both the confidence interval and the offset is in between this equivalent margin, then we say the scale-down model is equivalent. This equivalence margin is defined based on scientific considerations, so it's not a statistical margin. It's a scientific margin. But we want to repeat that there are scale-down models that are non-equivalent and they still might be suitable. And on the next slide, maybe go a little bit into some more details. I think we should really look at what is the intended use where we are using the scale-down models. If you think of, you want to investigate whether a process parameter has an impact or not, you might not worry about an offset. If your conclusion is there is an impact, you don't worry about an offset. On the other hand, we can apply offsets. We can consider offsets if they are scientifically explained. For example, if you know that they come from a sample storage issue, or if they are verified by an independent data set. The second point, the observed variability, that's also something that can be de-risked by either worst case studies or by an appropriate control strategy. Okay, so a lot of things about scale-down models. Now, I think it's important to also make this distinction between scale-down model and process model. There is maybe some confusion, and there's a certain gray zone between these two things. But we usually consider process model as mathematical descriptions of input-output relationships. So these are usually these models that come from DOE studies or multivariate studies. So yeah, they result from univariate and multivariate experimentation. They can cover interactions and quadratic effects. And when we assess the quality of these models, we do assess the coverage of the data and also their prediction quality. So they are also very powerful in their readout. With this, we can both estimate the value of the process output, so make an absolute prediction if we need it, but also the confidence of this prediction. And as it was already said several times here, we do think that process models cannot be verified over the entire range at scale. There is some possibility. We can assess them within the monitoring program. We can assess them via the continued process verification. So this slide illustrates a little bit more the whole route of process, the whole process modeling approach that we are usually doing. The first thing is the scale-down model qualification, where we have a certain control space or the target range here, and we do this the scale-down model qualification usually at target and assess here this against this equivalence margin. Sometimes we observe a small offset, which is probably within the, many times within the equivalence margin. So this is an equivalent scale-down model. And there is a certain range around which we want to operate the process in. That's the area that was formerly called the design space. We don't talk about design space anymore. So the next step is then setting up the process models, where we explore a larger range, and then we do this extrapolation from the control space to the borders of the design space here, and this is something we cannot do by on purpose at scale. That's something we can cover with continued process verification somehow. But there are limitations. Next slide. So the general limitations for process models is, in many cases, we cannot investigate all the process parameters in a single study, so we always will have a mixture of studies, or in most cases. So there is some uncertainty about our process models. I think that's clear to everybody. It's very difficult to investigate categorical variables like raw material lots, if not impossible. But we think that the continued process verification and the control strategy will overcome the potential issues related to this. And this is another thing. I think it's important to have this in mind when we speak about verification of a design space at scale. When you imagine here, this is a sample size calculation or evaluation. Let's assume that there is an IEC HPLC peak where we have an at-scale SD of 5%. You can say this is high or low or it's appropriate. I don't know, it's just a number that I put in here. And we have a model prediction where a process parameter is varied, and our model tells us this will influence the IEC pattern of by 2%. To verify this in a statistical way, that would mean that we would need 200 batches, so 100 before we make the change and 100 after we make the change, or 100 at small scale and 100 at scale. So verification, I don't know what this really means. Does this mean statistical verification, or does it just mean, okay, your prediction is not, it's hard to say what is verification here. Okay, and I think that was the last slide. And this is the team of the enhanced approach. I want to thank everybody for the input and for your attention.
Thank you, Frank. Before we go into the discussion, anything clarification-wise to Frank?
Yeah, we got a question over there. Please.
Abe Germansdorfer from Novartis. Thank you for the presentation. I think we need to be careful in presenting both univariate and multivariate statistics. So whenever we are dealing with limited data sets, as we do, and increasingly so with the large-scale data, we need to leverage the fact that we have a number of orthogonal measurements, and sometimes even non-orthogonal measurements that can be combined. The number that you quoted of 199 is true for a univariate case, but it doesn't have to be that large if we build and contrast a multivariate model. So there's always some opportunity to reduce the required number of data to gain statistical confidence by combining multiple data sets together.
Yeah, this was for one parameter that is very. I think it gives an idea of what sample sizes are necessary if we are speaking about changes that are smaller than the SD range of what was observed. I think it's true with multivariate assessments you can reduce the samples, but yeah, I think the point remains that you require really a significant amount of data to prove something statistically bulletproof.
Again, when we're speaking of a single term, but like you said, you're looking at multivariate models from the DOE study, so there's definitely an additional benefit to looking at the contrast in the context of the model. Yeah. I did have a question for everyone, I guess. So the model scaled down model qualification is at set point, and then we make an assumption that the large-scale data will behave as the model predicts outside of set point. This is a strong assumption that we make. Is there a feeling whether that is acceptable and will continue to be acceptable, or are we in some future going to be requested to run large-scale off set point?
Looking all at Kowid, yeah.
Well, no, I don't think there's any intention to ask or request to have a verification of at offset for all the ranges you are actually trying to cover at full scale. I think this is a misunderstanding. We will expect to see such analysis at small scale. Now, this verification, I don't think it's reasonable to have such requests at full scale. This is why we need to have appropriate mechanism in place that will make sure that you will be able to verify that even though you have no statistical bulletproof demonstration that they are fully equivalent, you have something that will make sure that it is still working as expected. So it doesn't. So at the end of the day, it's going to depend on how much weight you want to put on this downscale model. If it is really no way out, and you have to rely completely on these models. So in this case, you may have to do further studies, and perhaps, in particular in case where you have non-equivalence, may need to actually go into offset situations to verify this. This may not be the most appropriate nor the easiest approach to follow. On the other hand, you could also compensate such lack of equivalence by an appropriate control strategy that will actually cover what was not fully predictable by your downscale model.
I got a question, just a clarification from Frank. You're saying in your slide on qualification of the models that generic qualification should be possible. Could you just expand on what do you mean with generic in these terms?
Generic would mean that when we have, let's speak about antibody processes, and when we have shown that we have a huge database that, let's say, the downstream processes, the scale-down models have always shown that we have equivalence, that and we have done this for a number of processes, that we might leverage this data for a new process. So.
Yes, we got a question over there.
Yeah, so Luis Moraga from BMS. So I think one of the questions I would like to raise very pragmatically is when we look into the enhanced approach versus the traditional, is that to the traditional approach, we are trying to get assurance the process performs as expected to operate at set point. On the enhanced approach, what we're trying to communicate is that if we really understand both the molecule and we understand both the process, what we're trying to ask the regulators specifically is that can we operate different from the set points we initially have in order to manage our variability, whatever the source may be, in order to actually achieve a molecule that we intended to be in control. So this is really, in practical terms, from an enhanced approach, what we're trying to accomplish. So this goes back to the question that I think both Brandon and Frank were trying to allude to, which is what we call regulatory flexibility. Maybe putting on a different approach is that, can we actually actively control our process by our level of understanding? If we really achieve that enhanced understanding, how we actually, originate that molecule, can we deliberately, affect our process in order to end up with the molecule as we understand? And this could be because the raw material could be raw material variability, could be cell bank variability, could be difference of facility, and this is really what we're trying to get with the enhanced approach, and it's important to describe it that way, because for me this is really the two differences. On the traditional, we say that we achieve the molecule we want at the quality attributes that we want by running the processes at the set points we want. By the enhanced, it could be that way, or it could actually be we deliberately control it by actually changing the process. And I would like to hear some feedback on that.
We pass that over to our regulator colleagues. Not necessarily only Kowid, but there's a lot of them. Yeah.
Well, perhaps I can start. There's one point I don't fully agree with you when you say that traditional is only at set point. Actually, I would expect that even in traditional, you do have some, at least for some steps, for some of your studies, covering other ranges than set points. If you do this, it is also certainly acceptable, but you will end up with very tight ranges that will be more or less doable for a reasonable manufacturing process. So in most of the cases, you are not fully at target, although if you compare enhanced towards traditional, indeed, we expect to have more studies that are offsets, not at target with enhanced, and we will have less of such studies for the traditional. But I think you will have this. Now, in terms of flexibility, well, it's always difficult to ask this to a regulator because regulators are not flexible. That's the first problem we have. But on the other hand, you have to. I have some agreement with the description of continuum with PV, and it's not going to. We're not going to. But it's not just for PV, but process validation, but it's also for traditional versus enhanced approach in general. That is going to be quite difficult to give a clear cut on what is traditional, what is enhanced, and at the end of the day, I think the flexibility is something that will be somewhat I'm not sure how to say this. It's not the leftover, but it is what you have at the end when you have provided sufficient demonstration of evaluation of your process and good understanding. That could happen afterwards. But I think if you try to push regulators to be very flexible, what has happened, and unfortunately, is that we fear such challenging approaches, I would say, and we tend to actually put walls and even larger walls to try to prevent the uncertainty. And at the end of the day, we're building up something that may be unfeasible. This is why I think we should not focus too much on flexibility and try to remain on the science. Flexibility will come afterwards when you will really understand and have good control over your states. Because honestly, I think you should try to avoid pushing regulators to be flexible because it may be counterproductive with regards to what we all try to achieve. And I also agree that, and afraid, of course, that what we are creating may be too high of a requirement. So this is where we need to have a good science-based approach and not try to look for the flexibility yet.
But I also understand you, just to check the question a little bit on, let's call it an adaptive process, in the sense that if you have if we are okay with your proposed process, and you have shown that to us that if I work within these ranges, the output will be acceptable. And then depending on the input from a raw material, I may choose to work within this approved range. So that would be, in my understanding at least, an acceptable way, because that is a little bit why you are doing this. This is to be able to in a way neutralize differences in raw material, in starting material, to come out with a more homogeneous product with using a very adaptive and variable within qualified limits process to do that. So in a way, if we can live with what you have shown to us, I would say that could be an.
So if I can just follow up just one point on that, because I think that's a very important key message that you're giving us. We're actually not asking for flexibility on the quality of the molecule. I think the key point is that we are trying deliberately control the product better, and so I think that's a key distinction that we're trying to, and I think that's the message I think we have from the industry, that we're trying to actively control the quality of the product more actively than would have been maybe on the traditional approach. And that's, I think, the main difference between, at least in my understanding, and a couple of us, between enhanced and the traditionals.
Martijn?
Thank you. Well, maybe to follow up in that same sense, you can't have your cake and eat it. And from my standpoint, at least, I don't care if you want your cake or want to eat it, but you can't have a lot of flexibility with regard to your manufacturing process, and at the same time have a very limited release testing. I think this was, for example, the provocative idea of the AMAP case study. So I think it's important indeed to keep that in mind, that somehow you need some assurance to bring in sufficient assurance that indeed you are under control. And I think that's all too provocative ideas on that you can change everything and you don't have to test it because you can rely on your process so much. Well, I think, well, at least as a regulatory community, we have well, we are careful with that indeed. Thank you.
I think we had Stefan Gross over there.
Yeah, I guess you get the same feedback from almost all the regulators. The fear we have, because we have seen so many different cases where already small differences had an impact on the quality attributes, and therefore we are a little bit more careful. And I guess many of us have seen so many such cases. And especially with raw materials, we haven't seen any, let's say, submission where raw materials were tested. There were a lot of raw materials. So this is one of the, let's say, black boxes what we haven't seen yet. And as Martin said, with the, let's say, the control strategy was really stressed by industry now. And it's what we see is now is that we are moving towards less and less, let's say, limits, ranges. We're moving from release specifications towards in-process controls, towards alert limits, action limits. And at a certain point, you have to, let's say, to make consequences if you exceed a certain limit. And especially if we are talking about alert limits and action limits, we do not see these things anymore. If you exceed an in-process, let's say, limit, then you have to, let's say, take consequences. But if you exceed an action limit or an alert limit, there is not really always a consequence defined. And this is what we see, and that's why we are all a little bit more careful here.
Rij?
Brij Patel, MHRA. So I think from the dossiers I've seen, then the big concerns have been that so much is different in those dossiers compared to the traditional dossiers. And initially, it's very unclear what flexibilities are being requested, why they're being requested, and why they cover so many parts of the dossier. And then there's lots of small-scale studies, etc., to support different parts. But the way you just described it, to say, here's a one specific issue, we could set maybe studies around this variability for a set of parameters, and then here's a very identified flexibility we would like. That, in my mind, would sit much easier to understand what is being achieved. But when we see an initial dossier, and we have so many days to assess this initial dossier, and there's so many conflicting parts of the dossier where we think data are light, that creates a big problem when we come to sit together to discuss, you know, all the different parts.
Yeah, you really point out the importance of clear descriptions in the, because you could imagine we have quite a large amount of paper to look through in quite a short time and to really see that. So urging you to be very clear on where you are.
Let me ask a quick question. So do the words and terms and the practice of enhanced and design space have to come together? Do they have to be considered a pair if you took a strategy as such? Do you understand what I'm asking?
Well, I would say that if you are talking about a design space, yes, you will have to be in an enhanced approach. Now, if you have an enhanced approach, no, you do not necessarily need to have a design space.
So the answer is no. Right? Yeah. I'm just trying to tease it out, you know, because jokingly from the podium we say we don't like design space anymore, but certainly it's acknowledged, right, that it's causing a little bit of adjustment time in the industry to start to feel, get a measure for how we might manage around design space. So, you know, when we talk about mixtures of approaches or hybrid validation approaches, an enhanced approach might look like using those enablers we talked about, statistical experimental design approaches, detailed process development, using PAT tools and so on, using the small scale and pilot scale models carefully and diligently. It might look like a defined continued process verification program post-approval. It might have all of those elements, but minus that piece in between around design space. Would that in people's mind be becoming a very careful and well thought out and useful approach as an approach to PV?
Peter?
It's Peter Richardson from EMA. So I think around the room, everybody's got a sense that we've seen quite a variety of different approaches, and that's probably where we're trying to stabilize in the value of this meeting, and everybody's coming together to share the problems. So, you know, ultimately, how science-based it is will ultimately lead to more relaxation and more flexibility. So I think that's the key focus on it, and maybe the industry's coming at it the other way. We'll want everything from the start, and then you'll throw in the scientific elements to satisfy the regulators, whereas we're probably thinking, you know, we want to see a very robust scientific approach, and then we'll gradually move back in terms of the amount of and the stringency of what we need. So I think, you know, you're all getting a feeling that there's a bit of well, there are different approaches, and there certainly are. Some are very, you know, light, I think, in terms of the scientific data. So there's not a way to easily resolve that. I think through the growth of the guideline that is being written is probably one avenue. But don't forget as well, at the agency, there is, you know, a number of mechanisms by which you can actually approach us. So from the point of view of the QbD, there is a PAT group. If you've got a first approach to this type of you know, enhanced approach QbD, you can come and have a first discussion. But in addition to that, then I think also through the BWP, we are seeing some companies taking scientific advices, and we've had one or two good discussions with companies on the basis of the scientific advice. And I think that's a good opportunity and a mechanism for you to actually engage on the particular issue that you're working on, rather than maybe wait until you're well down the road and then are totally committed in terms of providing you know, a final data set. So it's a staged approach, but I think you need a bit more interaction, I think, with various regulators. You know, the agency certainly has its mechanisms, and also the national agencies as well offer advice from the experience that they've had. So I think you need to gather everything together and put it in a constructive package. And I think, you know, the feeling is that we've all worked very hard on this, not just yourselves, but the regulators, to get through ICH guidelines and to try and facilitate. And we're, I think, mindful that we don't want to overburden or have redundant studies going into dossiers just for the sake of it. But I think there's been a lot of noise in terms of the way it's evolved in the first period, so we need to stabilize that and get to a more consistent perspective. So there is still a degree of conservatism, I think, in the regulatory side, but I think there's a desire to move forward to a more flexible approach with the right short steps rather than maybe huge leaps initially. Thank you.
Stefan?
Just one brief feedback. It depends also on the data you want or you submit or you plan to submit. I mean, if you have, let's say, just small ranges, let's talk about, let's say, temperature between 35 and 38 degrees, I guess nobody will doubt that it might be possible. But if you come up with, let's say, strange ideas between 10 degrees Celsius and 45 degrees Celsius, we will ask this question: why do you want to have these ranges? So it depends also on the let's say, ranges you apply for. And if you have a common range, what is well known to us, I mean, it's more easy than it would apply for such a wide range.
Yeah, quick response.
Yeah, I just want to, you know, it's actually a little bit make a comment. It's a little bit paradoxical that, you know, actually in the industry, I feel we're being, you know, more and more scientifically based internally in the companies, you know, but somehow we've not been able to fully transpire that, you know, to the submissions. And I think this is a little bit paradoxical that we are on that. And I think that's excellent feedback that we are providing. And I'm sure we will take that, you know, to heart. And I think hopefully my colleagues as well, on that, because I would say that when we look internally right now, I think the quality of the scientific data we are getting and the science-based decision we're making is much more enhanced than it was, before. And somehow if we're not able to fully communicate that right now, it's something we need to actually improve ourselves as well. So.
Question on that?
I just have a comment because as we're here talking about all these enhanced approach and try to put that in the dossier for the application, but I think as a company, maybe we'll have enhanced approach after we approve the product for 5 years, and I think maybe it just change our thinking to say, okay, maybe after you gain more manufacturing experience, you do have that enhanced approach in potentially for your process. So I was wondering how that would change from a regulatory filing perspective, because typically when you file in the beginning and that's it, you don't want to make any changes unless it's really, there's a really business driver for it, right? So is it a possibility that we can open that road once you gain more process experience, either at scale or in the lab, that you can go back to the regulatory and say, hey, this is how we want to file in terms of the process ranging, and have a little bit of flexibility from that perspective.
Martijn?
Thank you. Maybe a counter comment. I think that there's a lot of semantics here, and I think what we should be, if I look at it, if I compare what we're doing and compare this to 5 or 10 years ago, and I have the feeling that I'm not the only one. On one hand, we've become somewhat wary of claims on quality by design, and design space will completely change the regulatory landscape and will be a whole new ballgame. On the other hand, what we've seen, I think, is that many of the principles and scientific ideas are more or less seeping in and changing what we're doing in practice. So I think, well, in a way, to quote a famous commercial, just do it. I mean, don't use any fancy word, but just come up with scientific data and put them in a submission or in a variation and show us that what you're doing is scientifically sound and will deliver a good quality product. I want to encourage science and to discourage fancy words. Thank you.
Brendan, you had a comment.
Yeah, I suppose it's a proposal. When we talk about the enhanced approaches and continuous process verification, our colleagues in small molecules, particularly in drug product, have gone and practiced some of these approaches already. And sometimes that's because they have a better control over variability. They understand some of the material issues in a better way. And certainly they don't have to deal with the complexity of biological variability we have in bioreactors. So I could envisage, one way for us to start this journey together is to look at a system that's a little less variable, such as one of our downstream steps, where industry provides a data set that says we understand the interaction of the key parameters, of all the parameters important for the operation of a step, so that if we made a change in the flow rates or load or many other factors, that we can demonstrate through our process understanding that we can retain control without having to stop, make a number of test batches, put them through all sorts of testing and wait for release and then review. I think the proof of our our proposal that we could initiate this kind of approach would be in a model like that, starting off at the lowest level of variability we have in our system, and show something in the that would be I would imagine a useful element to have in the guideline. Otherwise, we're still having a fairly philosophical debate about continuous process verification.
I think we should round off this discussion. There will be a final concluding discussion taking everything we have heard today after the coffee break, but just to check with Kowid on we had some questions for the enhanced approach as well on on what additional studies would you consider in an enhanced approach versus traditional, how to evaluate and verify reliability, predictability of models, and how to demonstrate validation of adaptive processes with feedback, feed-forward loops. I think some of them have been covered. Do you feel that there are anything we should have some more before we close this discussion session?
No, I hear that actually it's quite a difficult task to answer this question, since it is, I understood and I agree that we are in the real life, we're more in the continuum situation and not just in a fixed situation of enhanced or traditional. And that the level of data to be submitted will be on the burden of the company to demonstrate, and depending on the level of confidence they will provide, they may have an outcome which is more or less flexibility. So I think all the points has been mainly covered. We didn't cover too much the feedback in feed-forward loop. Well, on the other hand, is it really necessary to cover this? Because my conclusion could also be to avoid having any point on these aspects in the document, which appears to be the way forward here.